All right, today, good afternoon, everyone, or I guess it's still morning here in Sonoma. Good morning and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Planetary Pause series. Our pause is because we can't go anywhere during this time, as you probably all know. So today we feel very fortunate to be hosting Anu Partanen live from Helsinki, Finland. Anu is the author of the Nordic Theory of Everything in Search of a Better Life. Here is the book. I highly recommend it. John is putting some links into our local bookstore where you can buy this book. As you will hear from today, you will want to read it after you hear Anu. So she is a Finnish journalist who lived in the United States for several years, married an American, and became a U.S. citizen back in 2013. But eventually, I think the more humane services and compassionate culture of Finland was the lure that brought Anu and her husband back to Finland. So, having lived in both countries, Anu understands the disconnect between what we call, in quotes, freedom in the US as it contrasts with the intrinsic freedom inherent in the Nordic countries. So there is a reason why Finland has been ranked the happiest country in the world for the past 3 years. And today, Anu will tell us about some of the policies and quality of life that keep their citizens at the pinnacle of happiness and well-being. So welcome, Anu.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Glad to be here.
Pleasure to have you here with us. There's so many things I want to ask you about, and we won't get to them all, but our audience will ask you the questions I probably don't get to. But you made a statement in your book that I thought was very interesting. It's, quote, America is no longer the land of opportunity. Northern Europe is. Would you explain what you mean by that?
Well, the book itself is sort of a combination of partly of my own thinking, my own experiences and thoughts as I sort of learned to live the American life. And then on top of that, I did a lot of journalistic research. So I interviewed a lot of experts. I went through a lot of studies, comparing different countries. And one aspect of that was, how do we measure opportunity? The idea that is dearest to American hearts and to the idea of how Americans see themselves, that the United States is truly the land of opportunity where anybody with hard work can become what they want to be and fulfill their potential and be successful. And so I think all of the book, the different chapters look at family policies and healthcare and education and so on. So all of that combined, I think, forms, of course, a society where people have opportunity or they don't have, depending on their resources. Specifically, you could say that, for example, when the researchers have looked at how often people who are born into the lowest income quintile then are able to raise to higher income levels than their parents had, how often that happens. And these days, for example, that happens more often in the Nordic countries than in the United States. So the aspect of the US that has been its strength, that there's a lot of social mobility, meaning that people are able to move beyond the circumstances of their childhood or their background. That doesn't happen as much anymore in the US, and it happens more so in the Nordic countries.
I think one of the areas that a lot of the people on this call will be interested in hearing about is how education differs in Finland from the US. I know one of the things you wrote in the book that I thought was very interesting. There are no sports in the high schools there. I mean, this is about learning. It's not about sports. And there's so much, people are so distraught that they can't play, the kids can't play their sports during COVID. So I wanted you to speak about some of the differences, like when do children start school? What is the process of learning in the early stages first in Finland?
Yeah, it's in many ways different. I have to say about sports, though, that Finns are quite into sports as well. They just do it in their free time, so it's not tied to school. And a lot of people in Finland too are very upset now that the children can't participate in sports as usual. But yes, it's very different approach within the school system or the schools. I think it's important, sort of, if you look at the school system as a whole or education system as a whole, to understand that there's sort of a philosophical difference, partly in whether it is a parental choice how to educate your children, what type of school. and whether it is the society's sort of duty to give everyone the same opportunity. The US has the similar idea, of course, with public education, but at the same time, there's a very strong idea in the US that parents have to have choice in education, just the same way as you have going to stores, you have to have private schools or perhaps charter schools, or you have to be able to homeschool and so on. So in Finland, parents, in a sense, have a choice. They can look into which school they would like to get their children into, but all schools are public. There are some independent schools in Finland, but they are schools that have to get a permit from the government to operate, and they are usually German language schools, or some of them are religiously based, but they have to have similar curriculum as the national curriculum, and they can't charge students tuition. So there's a limit. The government can give them a permit to, I think some of them can charge maybe 600 euros of tuition to cover some extra textbooks. And there are few, maybe two in all of Finland schools that are international schools that follow international curriculum, and then they can behave a little differently. But that's a big difference in thinking. Practically all children in Finland go to public school. And if you think of the philosophy of sort of learning, most Finnish children attend daycare, but we don't really call it preschool or kindergarten or anything like that until the children are 6 years old. Until then, the daycare is a place where the children play. They spend a lot of time outside. They're not expected to learn how to read until they're 7 years old, basically first grade in school. These days, all children have to start as 6-year-olds in preschool, what we would call preschool. But the officially first grade starts when they're 7. And that's really the point when they're expected to start to learn math and reading and so on. But that doesn't mean that they're not taught anything before that. I think that's also a big distinction, because in the US, of course, you can have absolutely fantastic daycare centers, or as in everything, you can have everything in the US. You can have the best, and then you can have the less high quality, whereas in Finland, the quality is much more equal. But so, for example, my own daughter in Helsinki attends a public daycare center, and it's really fantastic. The overall in Finland, the requirements for education levels for teachers, their degrees are higher than in the US. The teacher training systems are very unified, so that all teachers teaching in all of Finland have very similar education level. And in schools, they have to have master's degrees. Now in daycares, they don't have to have master's degrees, but they are still very well educated. So even though it's sort of play and crafts and arts and playing outside, and they go sledding all day now when there's snow, I think the staff tends to be still well trained, and they sort of enter, of course, all sorts of educational elements to the school day. But in terms of, I think in the United States, there tends to be more focus on at an early age to start learning, and sort of in a more programmed way to teach early on reading and letters and math and so on. And Finns are actually quite relaxed about that until school starts. But even after, the school days tend to be shorter than in the US. They usually tend to have less homework and so on. So often people are sort of amazed that how is it possible that if you compare statistically, you look at Finnish children and they actually go to school less hours than in many other countries, but then they do very well in international comparisons of education, which is what Finland is really famous for. That's the most famous aspect of Finnish society abroad, usually, that people know that in international comparisons, the education system does really well. And from Finnish perspective, mostly, I think we think that the key is the teacher education, that all children have teachers who are well-trained and know what they're doing. And another key, of course, is funding of schools. In Finland, the school funding, it's partly localized and partly centralized, but still, even if localized, it's a municipal or city level. So it's not based on property taxes like in the United States. So schools have much more even amounts of resources to be used. And in fact, there's sort of the opposite view than what often happens in America and in Finland. They tend to direct more money to schools where children are struggling, or there's more immigrants who speak Finnish as a second language or so on. Whereas in the United States, of course, the opposite often happens, that the schools in wealthy areas have more money.
Well, as far as we know, Finland has the most outstanding educational system in the world. And give us just a few ideas of why you think that's the case. What do you have that's so unique? Like the high school curriculum, is it a lot different than here? Um, because it seems like the early education is so outstanding.
I think a lot of it is the teacher education is really important. The teachers have quite a lot of independence in how they build their lesson plans and how they teach. They can choose their textbooks and so on. But all of that freedom for teachers comes after they have the education that they need. So most Finnish parents and the society can sort of trust that, okay, well, they are well trained. They are all quite trained in a similar way, so we can trust that they know what they're doing. Then there's, of course, the question of resources, which I mentioned. I don't think Finnish schools have abundant resources, but they are equalized and they're well spent. The school buildings are good. All children get free lunches. There's always recess all through school and so on. So I think there's a very strong sense also that it's not just the school. I think that's often when I started working on the book, a lot of people told me that, well, you should write a book on education because that's what Finland's known for. And I was always thinking that, well, I don't want to write only about the school system because the healthcare system is part of it. The family policy system is part of it. All of that lays the groundwork for students, as we well know. The teachers can't do miracles. I think it's an interesting question, and I talk about it in my book a little bit, that is it that a good teacher and a desire to learn can overcome even if the child has to go school with an empty stomach because they don't have breakfast at home or so on. Of course, it's possible for somebody who doesn't have all the resources in life perfectly well to learn and to work hard, and teachers can do a lot. But I think in Finnish thinking, certainly you can't expect that's the only thing that happens, that really everything else around the school supports learning and gives the opportunities for children to really learn. But in Finland too, there's a lot of debates over education. I think internationally compared, Finnish education system is great, but within Finland right now, especially since there's efforts to try new things, to teach in a different way, to have different kinds of school architecture, to get rid of classrooms, to have the students learn in a more self-guided way. And a lot of parents are very concerned. So I think there's also this effort to develop the education all the time and teacher training. And I think that's a very good instinct. But of course, in Finland too, it's not always so obvious what is the thing that works, especially since the world is all the time changing around us.
Well, a couple of things that you mentioned in the book about the individual is really encouraged to become independent early, which is something that I don't think happens in our society so much. And that and the kind of madness around the achieving that we are bombarded with in our American society. And you don't seem to have that in Finland. There's more of a every individual is equally important. That's a concept that we don't really have here. And from what you said in the book, 100 years ago, or maybe even less, Finland was totally different than it is today. And how would you describe that evolution from where Finland was really quite backward to being at the forefront of so many things today and being ranked as the happiest country in the world? What happened between that period that made this emerge?
It is really quite the story, because Finland, if you think of times before World War II and so on, Finland was a very poor sort of agrarian country. There wasn't a lot of wealth. There's still today, we don't have a lot of, if you compare, for example, with Sweden, which has been sort of a regional superpower for a long time, and they have a lot of accumulated wealth and capital and industrial families, and Finland didn't really have that. People were not well educated for a long time. The school system, for example, was very different. If you think of my grandmother, in her day, all children had to go to school for about 6 years. And after that, if you wanted to continue, you had to pay. So it wasn't so obvious that even if you were talented, you could continue. And there was a big, long debate in Finland over, should we have one unified school system where all children would go to school the same number of years and so on. And it's interesting to me that because it really, it's sort of similar to debates that, for example, in the United States, people are often having today, that at the time in Finland, and this what I'm talking about now is 40s, 50s, 60s, when the Finnish education reform, for example, was discussed and debated, a lot of the more sort of conservatives had the view that no, we should focus on the talented children, and we have to focus on them, and then have them move forward with education, and that's more efficient, and everybody doesn't have to learn many languages, that's just a waste, and so on. But then in the end, the side won that felt that all children have the ability and should learn, because partly, maybe ironically enough, because Finland didn't have a lot of, we have forests, we have wood, that's about what we have. We don't have oil, we don't have gas, we weren't wealthy. There was a sense that, well, all we have are the people and we need to have them educated. So the education system gradually then was changed into a system where all children go through the same curriculum. There's no really gifted and talented programs. These days, children can kind of choose, and the older they get, the more they can choose specialties, but it's not like in the United States that from early on you start sort of picking and choosing children into different groups based on their perceived talent at that point. So I think Finland made a lot of choices along the way, slowly, in all areas, in family policies. First, there was, Finland is famous, for example, for a baby box, which is literally a box, a big box that has children, baby clothes in it, and all sorts of baby items. And everybody in Finland who's, when a family is expecting a child, they have a right to it. It's a government funded service. You can go and pick it up and get it. And the idea of it is that everybody has the basics that the baby needs when you're expecting a new child. And this, for example, started first as a help to poor families. And then slowly it was handed out to more and more people. And then eventually the thinking was that, well, everybody needs these clothes and the whatever thermometers you have in there, and the box can be used as a first crib. But also that it's good to give everybody the same thing, because it's a message from the society that we're here to help, and we appreciate you having a child and your family's journey. It also reduces the stigma of somebody who really needs it, having to get it and feeling like, oh, this is welfare, and then you feel ashamed that you have to get it. And so a lot of the Finnish thinking along the way evolved into a direction that we want all children to have a good start in life. And so we're going to support all children. And of course, some families would be able to, most families, of course, can buy baby clothes themselves. But it just sort of equalizes the start, and everybody can accept it without stigma. So it was a lot of incremental changes over the years. I don't think it was like one epiphany, but that's how Finland slowly moved. And now, of course, it's among the wealthiest countries in the world.
Right. It's extraordinary in a short amount of time, actually, that this happened. One of the areas you mentioned in your book, too, is the negative way that we look at welfare and big government in the U.S. versus the positive role of the government in Finland. And what do you attribute that to, that people see the government really as a much more positive force in your country? And here it's become, not for everybody, obviously, but for a large section of the population, it's seen as something negative. Do you feel most people in Finland really have a positive view of the government and its position in society and how it helps people?
Well, anybody who knows Finnish people knows Finns are notorious in complaining. So people complain a lot, and about the government services. There's a lot of discussion over them, but most Finnish people do like public services. There's a very well accepted idea that, yes, we want healthcare to be universal public service. People adore the pregnancy care that the families are sort of ushered into when you start expecting a child. There's a public system where you go and see a nurse. And of course, in the US, you go and see a obstetrician and then pediatrician and whatnot, but it depends on your insurance and so on. In Finland, these are all public services and people like them a lot. The education system, there's not really a lot of debate about private schools. There's all kinds of education related debates. But I think overall, Finnish people do see the benefits of having government provide services that are high quality and that in a sense, make life easy for you. Mm-hmm. One thing that I talk about in my book and I've been writing is that the American thinking often seems to be exactly focused on welfare, which means that the government provides something for the people who are unable to provide for themselves. And you have to be a little bit ashamed or embarrassed if you have to accept it. Most people, of course, don't want it and feel failed, like failures if they have it. And that the real way is then that you have private systems and people can then pick and choose what they want. In the Finnish thinking, it's more along the lines that, well, we pay taxes, government is there for us, all of us, and the government is a way to provide services for us, which saves time and money for everyone involved. For me, one of the big surprises was when I moved to the United States was how much time most people have to spend on arranging all these services. Even if you're well off, you have to start calling around and figuring out whether daycare center, is it good, is it bad, how much does it cost, do they have a queue? You have to figure out the school. Of course, it depends where you live in the United States, how much choice you have or how much you spend time on this. But then there's, of course, health insurance, which pretty much regardless of where you live, especially if you get sick, you really have to start looking at your bills and systems and insurances and whether the doctors in your insurance group's plan and so on. And in Finland, you're kind of saved from all of this. If I'm not sick, I don't think about healthcare at all. If I'm sick, of course, then you might have issues. You might want a certain doctor or whatnot. So, but overall, especially financially, it really saves time and energy that you don't have to think about this. You've kind of outsourced it to the government to do it for me. And mostly, I think Finnish people are quite happy with that logic. There's a lot of debate about whether it works as well as it should. And I think there's certain, like sometimes now having lived in the United States, where I really admire the American attitude of feeling like if something is not working, then I should do something to fix it and not expect somebody else to fix it. I think that's fantastic. I think it can turn against Americans in a sense that people often blame themselves for problems that actually are systemic and not just for one individual to solve. But in Finland, it can feel the opposite, that people have it pretty good and then they're constantly complaining and they're not solving issues themselves. But I actually think that one good thing about it is that people really feel ownership over the public services. They're like, I pay taxes, I want my good services, and they complain if it doesn't work. And so sometimes I wish people had maybe a little bit more perspective. In other ways, I think that that's good. That's how it should be. That's how you keep the politicians accountable and you make sure that the system works.
Well, it's interesting because it sounds like Finland and the people in Finland understand the concept of we the people as government more than we do, instead of separating it out from we the people. So we can learn from you in this respect. A couple of things that we touched on, and it's in your book too, and you mentioned it in connection with healthcare, is the anxiety in our society that shouldn't have to exist because we're worried about healthcare, we're worried about paying for medicines, we're worried about all these expenses that you in Finland and most European countries, people don't have to worry about these things. And unfortunately, too many Americans don't understand how good it is in Europe compared to here in healthcare. But I want to move to something before we finish this part. The pressure that you noted that Americans feel to achieve, to deal with things on their own, to always be positive, thinking positively, that to think something negative is a scourge on us in some way, that positive thinking is required. And I feel that myself, that in this society we always have to have a positive story. And it is a pressure. And I'd like you to talk about that and how that's different in Finland.
Yeah, that was a it is a big difference. And I often think that in people, just individual people, often the best thing about someone can also be the worst thing about them in the long term. And I feel a little bit the same about countries. I feel like in the United States, everything you just described, in many ways, it's wonderful that Americans are very energetic. There's this sense of that you should work for your passion and really pursue excellence, and you shouldn't complain all the time. You should, if something's wrong, you should try to figure out ways to fix it. You should think positively, and a lot of that is wonderful. I think it's when I was living in the United States, once I got sort of used to it, of course it's nicer to be around people who are more positive. Then on the other hand, there are real problems. And like I said, many of the problems are not for individual to solve. So then Americans put themselves and other people in a really unfair position, basically telling people that it's all up to you. And if you're feeling bad or you have negative feelings or you're not succeeding, then look in the mirror, when in reality, the cards are stacked against you. It's not really a level playing field where everybody could just solve their individual problems themselves. And it's not really all up to you. So then in that sense, it turns against itself, and I think against change as well, if everybody feels really pressured to hide basically their anxiety or anger. And then if you don't have an open discussion about it, then you feel like, well, it's just me probably who's not handling it well, whereas everybody is in fact struggling. I think in Finland it's sort of the opposite. The worst thing about Finland can be that there's no moratorium on complaining. Finns complain all the time and they can see always the negative, and it can become very tiring. But like I said earlier, I think on the other hand, and the positive side of it is that people are very quick to jump into also defending the weakest in Finland. So there's very strong sense that it's shameful that we have this poverty, that we have these people who we don't even have really there's no people sleeping in doorways in Finland like you see in the United States so much. The homelessness problem is, there are some people who are homeless, but the government and municipalities do their best to help them. And so the problems are at a very different level. Poverty in Finland is not like poverty in the United States in most cases, but still people are incensed by it. And that then of course can be a good thing, but it's not necessarily the most cheerful thing to be around. But the same I think goes for achievement. I really admire the American, and of course you can see it in American societies producing the best of the best. You look at the inauguration, and everybody of course was amazed by this young poet. And I just thought to myself that I cannot imagine Finland producing this person, that you have a 22-year-old who goes to Harvard and is reciting a poem for the world and is so self-assured. And to me, somehow I felt like that is the American pursuit of excellence and sort of achievement at its best, that people really can take their talent and really own it, and at young age be so exceptional. And so that's wonderful. But of course, then the other side is that people, young people, and everybody basically feels there's very strong focus on success, and Americans celebrate people who are successful, and it can start feeling like it's not enough to be ordinary. But again, to say that, for example, when I was interviewing and following American parents with children, and of course, especially in big cities and in wealthier families, there's a lot of pressure to get their kids into great school, and people are worried early on already that if the child is not on the right path from the beginning, they're not going to get into Harvard. And that can seem a little ridiculous, but I think it also rises from American society's cruelty, in a sense, that parents are worried that if the children are not among the best of the best, they can end up homeless or without health insurance. The stakes are so much higher. So that also sort of forces you to think that your child or you yourself have to be among the best, because the price of falling is so high. Whereas in Finland, I think people can be more relaxed in terms of thinking that, well, it's fine if my child, doesn't have a high earning profession. They still have healthcare. Their children will still get into good school. They still will have the basics in life. So I think that gives more room also to Finns not to feel so pressured to be really the best of the best or the most successful. But then on the other hand, of course, you could argue, some people argue that, well, that means that Finns are not then working hard enough and maybe not fulfilling their whole potential. And maybe that's sometimes true, but usually my take on that is that if you look at Finland as a country, as we talked about, it's a wealthy country. It has a lot of internationally successful businesses. It does have a lot of wealthy people as well. So I do think that as a society, at least, I think Finland has done fine and people have used their talents well, even if they're not 22-year-olds reciting poems at inauguration to the world.
Well, I think community is something that's very important in Europe and in Finland. And the individual is so celebrated in our star focused culture and hero focused culture. We have, I think, because of our media, our films, there's a need to excel and be different than. And it doesn't seem to be something that is an aspiration for people in Finland. It's much more relaxed, more comfortable. I mean, that's the take I'm getting. I haven't been to Finland. I've been to Norway and I've seen how it is there. And people just seem more relaxed. They're not worried about things that a lot of people here are constantly worrying about, even if they don't talk about, because the pressure to be positive means that you can't talk about all these things you feel pressured about. And that creates its own anxiety. So I think it's really wonderful to hear about your society. And one of the things you say in your book, social mobility without social investment is not possible. And I think that's something we can learn from you. And before we go to questions from our audience here, I'd like to know if there's anything more you want to say about the book, which I'm highly recommending to our audience, The Nordic Theory of Everything. Is there something I've missed that you'd like to bring out?
Well, I think people, of course, often, when I talk about the book, I mean, people, they say that, well, the United States and the Nordic countries are so different. You can't compare. The US is never going to be like the Nordic countries. And I don't think so either. Like, I'm not, of course, all countries have to figure out what's the best way for them, and countries are different. But I do think that a lot of the Finnish social policies and universal social policies, the solutions, they're not unique to Finland, and they're not necessarily Finnish invention. In fact, ironically enough, many of these, for example, education policies came from the United States. The Finnish educators would go to America and read and study what American researchers of education were recommending and saying, and then sort of bringing those ideas to Finland and fitting them into Finland. So I do think it's possible for very different kinds of societies to take the basic idea that government is there to provide universal services for everyone, with the idea that these are fundamental services that everybody needs to succeed in life. And perhaps one thing I think is different a little bit is, and interesting, is the approach to child and child's independence, which you sort of mentioned. In the United States, of course, Americans are very family focused, and families are closed, and there's this idea that family is the safety network, and it's the family's duty to be able to support their children through education and so on. And in many ways that's wonderful, but of course that becomes a problem if the family is unable to, for some reason or another, or unwilling to, or whatnot. And in the Nordic thinking, there's sort of this idea that children have rights regardless of their parents. And the society has the duty to then ensure that all children get what they need, even if their parents can't provide, don't want to provide, if so on. So I think that's sort of important to think about how, for example, about education and expecting children to go to school or so on. So in the Nordic thinking, there's a strong idea. I guess you could think about it in terms of it takes a village.
Mm-hmm.
But in the Nordic countries, it's not so much that, oh, it takes our neighborhood, or of course that's important too, but it's sort of brought to the state level that it takes a country to support children regardless of accidents of birth. So that's sort of, and it's an interesting discussion. I once was interviewed after the book came out by this conservative radio or podcasting host, and he was a very he was very interested in the book and its ideas, and we talked about education at the university level. And so in Finland, university education is tuition free for everyone. It's public, just like the lower levels of school education. And in fact, students get a small stipend to help them with rent and so on. Once you apply to get into university, if you get in, you get a stipend. And so we were talking about parents and children and the aspect of independence from your family. And in the Nordic thinking, even within family, if you have to rely on your family on the most essential things in your life, then you're indebted to them and they have power over you. And in the Nordic thinking, this can be a bad thing, whether it's husband and wife, or children and parents, or elderly parents and children. So the thinking is that you shouldn't really have to rely for your health care on your partner's employer or their employment, or children shouldn't have to rely on their parents to pay for tuition for their university and so on in the Nordic countries. And so he was saying, so I was making the case for him that this is how we think, that if you are already over 18, you should be able to apply to any university you want to go to study whatever you want. And it shouldn't be dependent on whether your parents want to pay for it or can pay for it, or whether your parents want you to go to law school because they pay for it. And he said that, well, he has two daughters who are at a university, and he feels it's actually a good thing that he has that financial leverage over them, because it's his job as a father to guide them, because young people do not make always the best decisions. And so it's good that he can sort of hold that over them if needed, that I am paying for your education to help them in life to go through the right path. And I thought, like, I understand that from sort of father's love point of view, but in the Nordic thinking, it's like, well, they're already old enough to make their own mistakes, and you can, of course, parents should guide their children, but you should not have that financial leverage over them. So that's sort of an interesting difference in thinking, both on everyday level, but then of course system-wide.
Yeah, that's a kind of a manipulation. I certainly experienced that when I was university age too. One last question I just want to ask, because it's important to me, is if in high school, in that particular span of years, do students learn critical thinking or philosophy?
Oh, wow, what a good question. Critical thinking or philosophy, I would like to hope both. I like to think both, maybe, probably, hopefully critical thinking. I don't know if Finns are that big on philosophy. I mean, I think at the time when I went to school, I remember the philosophy as a sort of a subject. Of course, it was you could choose it. I don't think it was even compulsory.
Okay. Because it
But
seems like most people will never get it in college if they don't get it earlier.
yeah, but now you're asking a good question. I haven't really looked at what the curriculums are like current day high school right now, and what they are required to learn at that level.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I first went to Yugoslavia, students there did learn philosophy in high school. And I was astounded at what they knew about philosophy. 18, 19-year-old young people. I don't know what it's like now, but they did learn it then. And of course, people can go through higher education here and never have one course in philosophy or critical thinking. So that's something I'm very concerned about, as interested in education. So I'm going to open this up now to our audience for questions. And I'm looking to see who, you know how to raise your automatic hand here. And if you don't know how, I think John can tell you, our assistant here.
Yeah, so if you're on a computer, basically you want to hit the reactions button on the window where you see everyone's faces. It's the smiley face on Windows.
On the bottom of the screen.
Yeah. It'll you click on it, and then you should see an option on the bottom. It says raise hand. That keeps order, so that's helpful. I'll do my best to keep an eye on people who raise their hands just on video too. But yeah, preferably you would use the raise hand feature.
Okay, I'm going to go to Matt first, and he is a retired teacher.
Hi, I'm very sorry. My sister lived in Finland and raised her kids there for 15 years, but she's now lives in New Jersey and she's still in class. She couldn't be here. Anyway, I had two questions. I'm wondering if you could speak to them briefly. Number one is what is the racial and ethnic diversity? Has Finland accepted many refugees in recent decades? And the other is, does Finland have a Anders Breivik element to their society, a white supremacist that is, you know, we all know what happened in Norway with him.
Yeah, those are really good questions. I don't have the numbers for you immediately on the diversity question, but Finland has become a lot more diverse than it used to be. I'd say since the start of the 1990s, there were people from Somalia arriving. There's sort of fairly big Iraqi community. There's of course a lot of Russians and Estonians and so on. But so it has become much more diverse. The change was really quite significant even while I was living in the United States for 10 years. You could see it in the streets of Helsinki and so on. Having said that, Finland has been on the more conservative side, definitely compared to, for example, Sweden, which is very open and these days extremely a diverse country. In Sweden, there's now more, let me get this now right, there's more proportionally in population, more people who speak another language at home than there is actually in the United States. Let me think that I got that right. Well, it's along those lines, either speak a different language at home or have immigrant background. Or from different nationality. But so Sweden has changed and it's very diverse now. Finland is less diverse, but it has certainly changed as well. And it is a good question how that impacts everything, because the Finnish housing policy tries to mix different types of city housing, wealthier housing and so on in different neighborhoods. So to try to avoid having certain neighborhoods where maybe you have people from immigrant backgrounds who don't speak the language as well and who don't are maybe unemployed or whatnot. And I think the Finnish society can also, all Nordic societies can actually be difficult for immigrants for many reasons, but partly also because they are so well-educated society where a lot of things are already automated. There's very few jobs that you can do without having a good education and language skills. And that's definitely been a problem with integrating the immigrant population into society fully. But then that relates to your second question that yes, Finland certainly has a very big political party, True Finn Party, that they themselves certainly would not say that they are white supremacists, and I'm sure many of them are not, but they are extremely opposed to immigration, and there's definitely racist elements there. Similar to other Nordic countries, I think all Nordic countries have definitely a similar, like I guess most countries these days, the Western countries, there's the populist movement that is very anti-immigrant and has elements of white supremacy. So yeah, Finland is not an ideal or super successful country in that regard. That is actually something that I would love to write about and research a little bit more, because I'm very interested in how that impacts people's thoughts about the sort of what I call well-being state and the policies and so on. But that's work in progress, of course, for Finland and for me still.
Well, the Lapps is your minority population, indigenous minority population.
Yes, and
that seems to have been dealt with very humanely, at least in recent times. Is that correct?
That's a good question, because I think that also in Finland is very much debated now. How have they been treated? I think originally not well, just like in many other countries, they were asked to, the children were asked to go to school in Finnish language and not speak their own language. And there's been debates over their land and so on. So now their rights have been more discussed, and the history finally has been discussed more and so on. So it's not a huge topic in Finland, perhaps because of the size of the population, and they do reindeer herding and so on with their own lands in the north still. But I don't think Finland necessarily has been dealing with that as well as we should either.
Okay.
And that maybe raises, I could say one thing that I often also say, that I really don't think that Finnish or Nordic people are by nature somehow more humane or altruistic than other people. People here are also racist and prejudiced and behave in horrible ways in many ways. And that's one thing that I often say about the Nordic system, that partly why people like the universal social benefits is just out of self-interest, because they feel like it serves them. And the society as a whole comes out ahead, but it's not really about that, oh, we're good people and we want to help other people, which is what Americans sometimes think too. And then I think that's also missing sort of the point that these are services that everybody, even the wealthy, use and happily feel like they serve them well. Okay, now questions.
I'm going to go to Evan next.
Yeah, I have a question and a statement. I'll do the statement first. I was convinced to come to this meeting by a friend named Kelly Rajala, who is one of the people here. And I just want to say that she loves your book and has the utmost respect for you. And because she is my favorite person in the world, I totally took her advice and came here. That's the statement. And the question I have is kind of part question and part comment. I know enough about sociology to know that it's hard to have social cohesion when you have very large groups. I learned in a sociology discussion about a year ago, before COVID made group discussions harder to do, that the ideal number of people for a society is around 150. That's like a tribe. And I think part of why the United States of America is not as sociologically healthy as Finland is because we're so much larger. There's 330 million of us, and I think Finland's smaller than that. I haven't checked the exact numbers. And I'm wondering if you think that our country, the United States, could have a government that's more altruistic towards taking care of the people if we were to split into several smaller countries rather than be one gigantic country. That's my question.
Well, that's a really good question. I guess in a way, the United States already has different states which handle many of their questions quite independently. Not everything, but states have different systems as to healthcare arrangements or education arrangements or funding various things or Medicare or Medicaid or so on. So in a sense, I think you're right that the fact that the United States is so big, of course, it makes it very hard to then have a unified, universal programs that people would accept everywhere in the country. On the other hand, if you compare size-wise, there are many states in Finland that are in the United States that are even smaller than Finland population-wise. So in that sense, if you were to take state level and pursue some of the policies, you could certainly do it closer to people in a sense and have a similar size level. So I don't think it's impossible, but absolutely, of course, we all know that implementing federal policies that would be the same in everywhere in the country is a challenge.
Okay, I'm going to go to Linda next, and then John, and then Michael. So you know what where you're coming in. So Linda?
Yes, this is Rocky.
Okay, with
Linda's
Linda.
partner. And I have a question in general. For example, home ownership in America is very disparate. It's not, and very subsidized for certain groups of people. Also, at the other end, once the economy hardens, we have to deal with home evictions. How would a home eviction be dealt with in Sweden?
Finland, but yeah, but the countries have very similar systems though. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, the American home eviction issue it's horrifying, of course. In Finland, the renters have much more rights. They're sort of like in everything. I think in the United States, the idea is so much that in legal maneuvers or contracts, everything is done sort of individually. But in Finland and in the Nordic countries, there's more sort of general rules that cover everyone. So you don't have to, everybody doesn't have to negotiate everything through. And for renters, there's much more rights in terms of if your landlord wants to just decides that they want their apartment back, if you've lived in the apartment for a year, for a year or so, then you have at least 6 months before you have to leave. And as for evictions, they have to have good reasons and give warnings and so on. So actually, apartment owners tend to complain that the protections for renters are too high. But also, I think the issue is different, or in that regard as well, that Finland has systems that if you don't have income, then you are entitled to assistance. You're entitled to assistance with your rent, you're entitled to assistance, cash benefits, and so on. So the world talked a lot about Finland's study on universal basic income, which was a couple of years ago. The Finnish National Social Insurance Institute conducted a study thinking about what would it mean if we had universal basic income. But in a sense, Finland already does, and all Nordic countries do, because there is a basic level that everybody has to have at their disposal. And if you're not making any money, you have unemployment benefits that are better and last longer than in the United States. But you also then are entitled to assistance. And while that is more or less welfare, it's means tested, is what I mean. Still, for example, a lot of Finnish people do get housing assistance with their rent. So I don't think people are put into the position in the United States at all as often where they would be evicted because they can't afford to pay their rent, because then they get government assistance.
So what's the immigration policy for Americans coming to Finland?
Like I said, Finland actually hasn't been that open to foreigners, so I'm afraid it's difficult.
Yeah, we probably couldn't learn Finnish. So I'm going to go to John next.
Yeah, thanks for having this first off. And I wanted to say, first, is misinformation, targeted or otherwise, a big problem in Finland? And further, how would you say the Finnish government approaches dealing with technology's rapid progression, particularly in the fields of AI, cybersecurity, and automation?
Well, overall, I think misinformation is a problem. It's not as big a problem yet as in the United States, but it's a problem everywhere in the world. And Finns are concerned about Russia, obviously, Russian efforts to influence Finnish conversations and otherwise, since the world is so connected these days, that even in Finland, I think a lot of Finns have actually been baffled by the fact that Finns are quite well educated. Typically, Finns have had very high respect for education, for teachers, for in many ways for authorities and experts. And now we do have people believing in QAnon theories, just like in the United States. We do have people who are skeptical about vaccines. So it's a problem here too, but I don't think it's a problem at the same level or length as it is in the United States. And hopefully the fact that all Finns have access to good education has helped in that regard as well. And on the other hand, I think it's also, I've been thinking about this a lot. I don't have obviously any obvious answers, but about how the American system already, people live very different lives because everybody kind of tries to build their own life, whether it's what kind of daycare, what kind of school, what kind of job, what kind of health insurance, because you have to negotiate. It depends where you live, which city, which state, what kind of employer, what kind of job situation. So that creates already space for people to feel like they already have different realities. And then, you know, what do you believe in and what reality is the right one? And you don't even know really how other people live or what they're doing in their lives. But Finland has still much more, partly social cohesion, but especially everybody has similar frameworks in the society because there's the universal systems that serve everyone. Everybody kind of knows what school is like for other people, what kind of lunches they had in school, what kind of healthcare they have. And I think partly that can help in keeping people somehow tethered to reality. As for the Finnish government's efforts, I'm not really the one to say how well they are responding to cybersecurity threats. There's certainly been some scandals in Finland, not in government so far, but for example, private therapy chain of therapists basically had their information stolen and people were blackmailed and so on. So I think Finland's quite advanced technologically, and certainly government thinks about it. And a lot of the government services are online and easier to use than in the United States, tax office or healthcare or so on. But that of course comes with danger if you have everything online. So far so good, but yeah, I don't really know otherwise in terms of government cybersecurity. Maybe there are holes that I don't know about. We'll find out soon enough, I'm sure.
Right. Okay. Now I'm going to Michael.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Anna. It's a pleasure to hear you talk. I bought your book a couple of days ago. I haven't started reading it, but I did read your op-ed in the New York Times when it first came out. I remember reading it and saying, "Wow, this is great." So I have a question, but actually first I want to answer a little bit what Evan brought up, because I do believe the United States is capable of social cohesion, and I don't think it's population that is the impediment. I think it's a lot of it is governmental policy and governmental philosophy. I mean, you talked about, Anu, just the American zeitgeist of kind of this libertarian, small government, do it yourself, everybody for themselves, sometimes dog eat dog. But in the United States, there's been a couple of times when the social cohesion was really strong and things were aimed towards the collective good. The 1930s, I mean, there was a very difficult period in the United States and world, but people came together for the greater good. And it didn't start till there was a change in administration from the Republican Herbert Hoover to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the policies really were oriented towards the success of everybody and the common person. And the 30s was a very strong period in terms of the celebration of the common human being and humanity of everyone. So it's possible. We heard Joe Biden, his inaugural address, and even before and since in a few days, he's talked about celebrating everybody, the common person. So we need that mentality, but also governmental policies. And you know, as you're talking, Anu, I think, you know, Finland has strong social cohesion because of the policies. So Evan, there is hope, and if we all come together. So Anu, my question is, you've talked about Finland and Northern Europe and the Nordic way, and we know that most of Europe is social democracy, and most of the European countries on the World Happiness Report, you know, land in the top 10 or top 12. I know the United States is 18th. I think France was 23rd. My son is currently living in Austria in school there and moving to Switzerland very soon. And I've visited him numerous times, and I think it's a beautiful country. So I wonder, what's your perspective on Finland's social democracy versus some of the other countries in Western, Southern Europe and their social democracy, and how they stand, how they compare to Finland, how they're doing, and so on.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Hardly, I'm not an expert so much in sort of the other European countries' social policies, but I did look into in my book, for example, on different healthcare policies, because healthcare is of course really interesting because you can do it in so many ways as a country, and countries have done it in very different ways. And in all of Europe, there is definitely the shared idea that it has to be universal, that everybody should have right to healthcare, and it should not bankrupt you, and it's not a service that you can leave to the private market alone, and so on. But then they have different approaches to it, whereas the Nordic countries have this sort of the UK model, where it's a taxpayer funded service. Basically, we pay taxes. Most of in the public healthcare system, doctors and nurses are employees of the government, just like firemen or police officers are in the United States. And that's how it's funded. And then there's small co-pays, but individual Finnish people don't have separate insurance plans, for example. We're all sort of insured by the national insurance plan. But when I first came to the United States, I didn't really understand what these health plans were that people were talking about, because I had to never deal with it. I don't have to apply. I don't have to. But then on the other hand, you have Germany, for example, that has a different system, that they do have private non-profit typically non-profit health insurance companies, and the government regulates the services that all these insurance companies have to offer, and so on. And then people can choose, or it's related to their profession, which one they belong to. So it's a little bit of a different system, but it has the same idea that government should set the framework for what everybody needs to get and at what price and so on, so that it can't be left to the market. So there's different ways of approaching the same goal, if you will. But then there's differences as well in I think partly in relation to gender equality or the view on family. I think Nordic countries are, like I said, very focused on individual children's rights, and but also women's rights in supporting women's ability to work and have careers, and in most Nordic families, both parents work and the children then go to daycare and school, and then parents share responsibilities. Of course, in Finland, just like everywhere, women tend to do more or stay home longer with their children and so on. But overall, that's the idea. Whereas in Germany, I think there's a lot more women who still stay home longer, and a lot of the tax policies or other policies can be geared more towards supporting a family where one person is the main earner and another person stays home. So I think there's sort of interesting differences there that come from perhaps cultural views or views on what family should be and so on, even though they have similar goals in terms of providing all citizens with certain services held by the government.
Okay, I'm going to go to Mike next, but before I do that, I just wanted to ask you, do you know what the proportion of women is in the Finnish parliament?
Right now, I haven't looked at it. Usually it's about half. It might be slightly less than half, but most of the time it's about half. And the government, the cabinet of ministers tends to be usually 50-50. And right now, of course, we're sort of Finland is famous for that the main parties, all of their party leaders are women, and our prime minister is women. So most of the most important ministers in the government, we call them ministers, but the cabinet secretaries basically are women. So in politics, it is much more gender equal than it is in the United States. Yeah. Interestingly enough, I should mention that that's not really the case in business world. American women are actually more likely to be managers and executives in the private business than in Finland. And I think that's a problem for Finland. And it probably has many reasons. Part of it is that the parental leaves are more generous in Finland than they are in the United States. And so that has many good things. It allows families to focus on their children while they're babies and small, and then you return to your job and all that. I think is, for me, it seems that it's the most sensible way for people's quality of life and for children. But the other side of it is that in America, I think women who are very focused on their careers or who have to go back to work, they go back to work very quickly. So they don't miss parts of their career. In Finland, it can easily happen that since women often stay home almost a year to breastfeed and take care of the baby first, then of course they kind of start falling behind a little of men in their careers. So I think that's a problem, and that's debated in Finland all the time as well. And in the Nordic thinking, mostly people think that the solution is to get men share more equally childcare.
Right. So I want to go to Mike. We're going to, I think, take one more question after Mike, and that will be it. So Mike.
Hi, thanks a lot. And thanks, Georgia, for bringing. I know this is really, this has been great. So just a quick question. Nobody else brought it up about the, and I kind of get an idea from everything you've just said, but I just want to hear you sort of go into it a little bit. How come Finland did such a better job as one of the best countries in the world when it comes to the COVID, much better than other Nordic countries also? And what is it what is it about the government that made that happen, and about the people? And how did they react to whatever restrictions or the way that the government dealt with it? Why is it so much better than so many places in the world? I'd like to just get your take on it. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Yeah, good question. I think we'll probably have a lot of analysis once all this over, how it all went down. There's probably several things. Part of it is that Finns tend to, like I said earlier, overall, Finns tend to believe in experts and in science, and in government as well, in ways that sometimes can be a little bit alarming and maybe not. I was a little surprised when the COVID crisis really started, a lot of Finns were demanding the government that they have to shut things down. People were, and then sort of you could say that, well, shouldn't we have Swedes were thinking more that we should have individual responsibility, that the government advises people but doesn't close down all business or whatnot, restaurants and so on. Finns took a different route, and the government did implement very strong restrictions quickly. But a lot of people demanded it. They really felt that for the health of everyone, it's important that we have these shared rules that everybody has to abide by, and the government has to take action. So I think that's very different, of course, from thinking in many other countries where you would think that, well, it's up to the individuals and we shouldn't. And that can be a dangerous road too. I think, I'm sure we're going to have a lot of debates in Finland about our mentality, which served us well in this crisis, or so far has served us well. But does it serve us well in all other crises? I don't know. So that's one aspect of it. Another, of course, is that Finnish culture is actually there's not big families living together if you compare to Italy, for example. Mostly there's the parents and the children, and then the grandparents live somewhere else and so on. So I think that makes a difference, of course, just sort of the proximity to other people. But the government, Finns are debating, a lot of Finns are complaining that the government is not doing the right thing. But again, I think if you look in international perspective, the Finnish government has done a great job and the situation has been very good. But Finns are always very eager to ask more of their government.
I think it was interesting that I've looked up the statistics of COVID cases and deaths in Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland. And Sweden had, I think, 3 times as much of all the other Scandinavian countries combined, both in cases and deaths. So their laissez-faire approach to COVID was a complete disaster. Even their king and prime minister has now admitted that that was a disaster. So Finland, Norway, and Denmark definitely took the right path on that. So I want to ask if there's one more last question. Otherwise, we will have any last words from Anu, and we will finish. I don't see anybody's with a hand up, so I'm going to...
I see Stella. Stella has a hand up.
Sorry. Okay. I don't see where... Oh, I see where... Okay, Stella, do you want to go ahead? I don't hear her.
There you go. Okay.
Hi. Thank you for sharing, Anu. I got a narrow question and a more general one. Being 100% Finn, my mother came from Finland. My father is an American-born Finn. I'm just wondering, the narrow question is if that bloodline could be tactically used to my advantage should I decide I wanted to immigrate. And the second question would be about, I imagine income taxes and other taxes must be higher to pay for these services. If you could make a comment about that. And then just the last general thing, just a note that it's difficult for us here for the government to institute policies. It's even impossible because we're really a collection of 50 different states. And, the government can only, like, for example, do a mask mandate, like on federal properties or interstate travel, but it cannot do it for other states. So that, that's a limitation when it comes to something like fighting a pandemic. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Very different situation in the US in that regard, with the states' rights and different approaches. As to your question about passport, you should look into that. I'm not sure, but definitely there was one point where people of living in Estonia and in parts of Russia who were of Finnish ancestry, I think they got a special permit that they could just prove that they had ancestry, and then they got a Finnish passport. But you don't seem that far removed, so you might be able to still apply for it. I mean, certainly children, maybe even grandchildren of Finnish immigrants to elsewhere could get it. As for taxes, that's a really good question. Yes, I get that a lot. certainly overall, the Nordic countries collect more taxes than the United States does. That's how the system works. We pay taxes and then we get services in return. So of course you have to pay for what you get. It doesn't miraculously come from somewhere. But I think income taxes are typically lower than Americans think, for sure. In the US, a lot of people think that, well, in the Nordic countries, probably everybody or high earners pay like 70% of their income in taxes. That's really not at all true. And the comparisons are really difficult because it depends, of course, where you live in the United States. When I lived in New York City, I filed my taxes in New York City, in the United States, and in Finland for 3 years. I had to do that. And so I could see that with the same amount of income, which was quite low at the time because I was starting as a freelance writer, I didn't make that much money, but I actually paid a little bit more in New York City because I paid federal, state and city taxes. And then I was self-employed and I had self-employed tax. So it was quite a shock to me to realize that in fact, my income taxes were quite high in the United States and higher than they were in Finland. So Finland has more progressive taxation than the US in that sense. And the wealthy in Finland certainly pay more in income taxes than in the United States, but even they don't pay 70% of their income. The highest marginal tax rates are around 50%. But then, of course, that's only a certain amount that goes above the highest level. So overall, you can say that, yes, I think overall people pay more taxes because then there's more taxes on consumption, gas, especially the government sort of sets tax policy that things are deemed to be harmful in one way or another, then they tend to have higher taxes. So a lot of consumer goods are more expensive in the Nordic countries. And food, I think, on average level can be more expensive than in the US. But I find that in the US, it's easier to buy cars, they're cheaper, or gas, which is of course important if you needed to move around, but then it's extremely expensive to buy healthcare. And in Finland, healthcare is included in your taxes and education is included in your taxes and so on. So my view actually is that people in the Nordic countries in that sense get a better deal, especially if they're not super rich. But I don't think in the United States, the wealthy either, they certainly pay less taxes, but then they live in a society that has a lot of instability and anger. And is that really a better life for you? Well, I guess everybody thinks for themselves.
We're a little envious of what you have and actually of what a lot of European countries have in contrast to the lack of social services and social support in the US. So we're working on that now with the new government. We finally got through that creature we had. So I want to thank you, Anu. This has been a wonderful experience, and thank you for your time and your generosity with us. It's been lovely. Oh yeah, you can unmute yourselves and we can all applaud.
Thank you. You're very kind, and thank you for having me. It was really nice to chat with you.
Thank you. Well, we're going to stop the recording and I will get the link to